So now for something very different. Years ago, I was working on the coast in eastern Sicily, and I stayed in a hotel close to the foot of the volcano Mount Etna. What I remember is that night I found it very hard to fall asleep because the windows in my room kept rattling. However, the next thing I remember was being woken up by a terrifying boom that catapulted me out of bed and had me running barefoot into the winter night. This is what I saw: Etna erupting by moonlight. I know now that there was nothing wrong with the windows in my room. They were rattling because of the earth tremors caused by magma and gas forcing its way upwards through solid rock. And that percussive booming was the voice of the depths of the earth, a sound more primitive and stirring than anything I'd ever heard before. Now, ever since people first settled on the slopes of Etna 3,000 years ago, we've been trying to interpret that subterranean language and to find metaphors to explain the volcano's behaviours. The first people, as I said, were the Greeks, and they created a mythical world, gods and monsters inside the volcano. One of these monsters was Enceladus, a typhon, who seemed to personify the perpetual rage that they sensed coming from underground. He's a 100-headed, fire-breathing hell-raiser with huge leathery wings and coiled serpents instead of legs. His head brushed the stars, and his enormous body was scarred and scorched by the thunderbolts thrown at him by Zeus during the war between giants and gods for control of the cosmos. He was taken captive during that war and imprisoned between the whole weight of Etna. And here we have it. By throwing himself against the walls of his prison, he created the earthquakes that dog that corner of eastern Sicily. And his fiery breath was so hot that it could melt rock and send it shooting up into the sky. Of course, if you live on Etna, you're always looking up at the summit, rather like you look up at a clock if it's on the wall, and there's always something coming out. It might be just little wisps of smoke, and for the Greeks, that was the work of the Cyclopes, 3 of them, working away in the forge in the bowels of Etna, beating out thunderbolts for Zeus. So I think we could say, I think it's true to say, that in most places in Europe, people shape the landscape that they live in through building or through agriculture. Not on Etna. Her volcanic landscapes have always seemed able to shape the culture and the beliefs of the people who live there. So that when Christianity began to take over from paganism on the volcano, we see a new geomythology forming. No longer are eruptions the work of furious monsters. They become punishments visited on sinners by a god who, instead of being inside the volcano, is in heaven high above it. However, Etna's earliest Christians didn't turn directly to Christ for protection or intercession. Every little town and village on Etna chose a local saint, very often an early Christian martyr, and they put all their faith in his or her powers of intercession and protection. For example, these candelore, which are an essential part of every saint's day, every saint's festivity on Etna, are a gigantic representation of the candles that used to be lit for the gods of the underworld by the ancient Romans. Relics, sacred objects, and ex-voto images that have been relegated to the past elsewhere in Europe are still very much alive on Etna, where people continue to believe in their powers of protection. These pre-industrial forms of Catholicism were practiced all over southern Italy until 1900. So the very real risks of living on an enormous and very active volcano, I think, have led to the perpetuation of these ancient, what shall I call them, local litanies that are unique to certain places, and ancient rituals that have died out elsewhere. But having said that, I want to tread very carefully, because not for a minute do I suggest that people on Etna are superstitious or bound by arcane belief systems. I know them. They're thoroughly modern people. But I think it's very understandable that they choose to perpetuate, to preserve rituals, ways of behaviour that have been giving comfort, been given reassurance on the volcano for thousands of years. Set against these ancient local beliefs, though, is the cutting-edge science emerging from the INGV, the International Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology on Etna. And that's in Catania. And they have one of the most sophisticated volcano monitoring systems in the world there, which they use to try to understand the language, as I like to see it, the voices emerging from the depths of the earth, and to gather any signals that might presage a major eruption or an earthquake. Instruments on the volcano stream live data to this control room about fluctuations in the composition of the gases that the volcano emits, changes to the contours of the landscape caused by the movement of magma and gas beneath the surface of the earth, and tiny earthquakes triggered by those movements. They work among these flickering screens like doctors in an intensive care unit, constantly checking Etna's vital signs. And for them, this is the language, de profundis, Etna's language, which one of them once described to me as a very ancient form of Sicilian dialect. But unfortunately, he said, it's polysemic, so the signals don't always mean the same thing. Of course, Etna sometimes spells out her meaning, as she did on the north flank at the ski resort, where they've made 2 attempts to build a hotel. The first was destroyed by an earthquake in 1985, and they took note. They built the next one to be earthquake-proof. And it was engulfed by a terrible eruption in 2002. So this is Etna's language. This is how she talks to us, the same INGV scientist said to me, like a modern-day soothsayer reading entrails. Whatever they do, those scientists, with all their wonderful equipment, can only predict a major eruption by 2 or 3 hours. And this is where dogs and goats come in. Martin Wikelski of the Max Planck Institute, he's head of the Institute of Animal Behavior at the Max Planck in Germany, and he's been monitoring the behavior of goats on Etna ever since some farmers told him that their goats on the north flank this was in 2011, could predict eruptions. And so he put collars on them to track their movements and spent 2 years tracking their movements and comparing it to Etna's activity. And indeed, he discovered that a good 6 hours before a major eruption, these goats would start to frantically rush around and hide themselves in the undergrowth. Wikelski's always been interested in the way that animals seem able to sense natural disasters. And I'll just go on to tell you that he's now enrolled a whole lot of stray dogs that used to be my neighbours. And when you see them scratching a difficult-to-reach itch or going through a rubbish bag, it's hard to believe that they're now giving data to a satellite, which is then coming back to the Max Planck Institute and being monitored in real time. And Wikelski says that this vast pool of data, which he's actually gathering from animals all over the world and insects and birds, he believes it has the potential to change our understanding of the planet as radically as the Human Genome Project deepened our understanding of human DNA. So I'm just going to finish by saying, good dogs.
Wonderful, thank you. A whole range of different languages engaged there. A simple question, arguably. Is all of this a window onto how humans deal with all that is unpredictable in life?
I think it's a very interesting window for us to look at communities who've been dealing with natural disasters and living alongside the utterly untamable forces of nature, living their normal lives, how they build that into everyday life, how they manage to live there, how they stay there, how now, as modern people, they choose to stay there. And I think we have a lot to learn from them. And one of the things we have to learn is that when they're told to move, they move. Unlike in Britain, where we're told to move and we just stay a little bit longer.
Thank you. Wonderful wisdom in that from the dogs and from the volcanoes.